Hello, everybody, and welcome to Creation Myths. I'm your host, Dr. Dan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and the thing that we do here is we talk about creation science and creationism and why it's always. If anybody has any sound issues at any point during the video, just let me know in the chat because I have the chat open and I will be able to see it. It sounded fine on my end though, so I am going to continue with the show. So before we get into tonight's topic, which is something we've done before, before we get to that, just some programming kind of notes for everybody. So, first thing is, I hope it is clear that I am trying to maintain a more regular schedule here. I'm trying to get something out into the world every Wednesday, give or take. So I've been sticking to that for the last few weeks so far, and we're just going to keep trying to do this. Have something to put out into the world that shows something about how creationism is wrong every Wednesday. To that end, I have some really interesting things coming up. In the near future, I'm going to do a literature review with a friend of the channel and actual friend, Dr. Zach Hancock, looking at a recent paper by Dr. Rob Carter. So that'll be at some point soon. And I have some other interesting things queued up as well. So, like I said, trying to keep to a once a week Wednesday schedule, whether it's an upload or live like we are tonight. That's the plan, and I hope I can stick to that. So far, so good. So all that being said, tonight we are doing an installment in the Wrong Answers Only series, where we go through the answers in Genesis, the answers books, and talk about why they're wrong. So we're just going chapter by chapter, and when there's something that I can comment on, I'm going to comment on it. When I say something that I can comment on, we're talking about things like biology, genetics, evolutionary biology, human evolution, that kind of stuff. A little bit of geology, but not a lot. Not going to touch on any of the theology that goes on in there. There's some linguistics in one of the chapters I'm going to talk about tonight. We're not going to worry about that, not my field. But that's generally what we're going to do with this series, looking through these books. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's pick this up where we left off a while ago. We'd gotten through the first 4 chapters of this book. This is the New Answers book number 1, and there are, I think, 4 New Answers books that we'll eventually work through. So we're up to chapter 5 here, which, as you can see, is called What About the Gap and Ruin Reconstruction Theory. So this is the idea that there's some missing stuff in Genesis. At some point in there, there's a gap between the narrative in Genesis, and that is where we can fit the old Earth timeline that Ken Ham doesn't like. Now, both chapters that we're going to cover tonight are written by Ken Ham. I don't know the degree to which he uses a ghostwriter or anything for these books, but both of these chapters are attributed to Ken Ham, so that's what we're going to go with. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through these. We're not going to do them in detail. I'm just going to go through and point out the errors that I've highlighted here, just the really basic, simple errors that should not be there. And we can start right here with literally the first line of the chapter. Ken Ham writes, because of the accepted teachings of evolution, many Christians have tried to place a gap of indeterminate time between the first 2 verses of Genesis 1. That's wrong right off the bat. It's not about evolution that gets you your old Earth timeline. It's geology. It's physics, honestly, right? It's radiometric dating. And it's not just one technique that does it. There's a lot of techniques that are independent of each other that all get you the same basic age for the Earth, 4.5, I think it's 4.56 billion years. And there's a bunch that get you right into that range that, again, are independent of each other, but they all show you the same thing. Right? It's not about evolution saying, oh, we need long time frames, or as Ken Ham would kind of talk about, interpreting the fossil record as something that's ancient. It really is all about the geology and specifically the radiometric dating. And to just spend just a second more on this, I know I talk about this specific thing a lot, but we know that radiometric dating is valid because of the Oklo natural nuclear reactors. At some point, I'm going to have to do a standalone video on that topic, even though it's a geology thing rather than a biology thing. But it's something that I find really interesting, and it's just a beautiful confirmation of the principles of radiometric dating. So I won't go into the details of that now, but I encourage everybody to look up the Oklo natural nuclear reactors, OKLO, because this is an event that happened approximately 2 billion years ago, and they confirm to whatever extent you can prove things in science, they prove that radioactive decay, nuclear fission, neutron capture, those processes have been operating in a constant way at a constant rate going back at least 2 billion years, right? So again, it's geology, not evolution, that necessitates an explanation for the old Earth here. It's all about really the geology there. I promise not all of my notes are going to be that long, but right off the bat, we got a big error right there. So this is a really interesting thing, and this is really important here because this is kind of Ken Ham's shtick, this next thing right here. All versions of gap theory impose ideas out on scripture and thus open the door for further compromise, impose outside ideas on scripture. Now, there's two things here. One, this is like Ken Ham's thing, and this is AIG's thing. If you don't accept Genesis literally, then the rest of everything falls apart. And, a lot of theologically minded people disagree with that, right? I'm not going to comment on that side of it, but I will comment on the hypocrisy here, because AIG does some extra biblical stuff too when it's convenient for them. And just like a silly little example is at the Ark Park, right, down in Kentucky, they have a whole thing with like Noah's sons' wives, and they identify who these women were, and like I think they have names, and like that's not in the Bible. These women were never named; they're just kind of there. So AIG does extra textual stuff too when it suits them. So it's a little bit rich for Ken Ham to be pointing it out here. Now down here we're down to this part now. Christians have made many attempts over the years to harmonize the Genesis account of creation with accepted geology and its teachings of billions of years. I just want to point out there that yes, it is geology, right? That is the thing. It's geology. That's the field that gets us to billions of years, right? And that's been the case for basically as long as kind of the modern field of geology and the modern concept of scientific explanations for the age of the Earth, right? It's really been geology has been the leader in that. That was, literally hundreds of years before like evolution existed as a scientific concept. There were kind of proto-geologists that were going, it sure seems like things are older than we may think, right? So that one is actually accurate. It is geology. So again, I'm skipping things that are not relevant to my expertise here. So there's a lot of theology in these chapters, which if that's your thing, I encourage you to pick up the book and cover it. But I'm skipping the theology in here. There's a lot of it. So too far. Okay, so this one now, right here. Gap theorists accept that Earth is very old, a belief based on geological evidence interpreted with the assumption that the present is the key to the past. It's not an assumption. We can verify that, right? We can verify over long periods of time through things like the Oklo natural nuclear reactors that the processes we're using to date the age of the Earth actually have operated in a constant fashion over some long period of time. This assumption implies that the past sediments containing fossils formed at basically the same rate as they do today. This process is also used by most geologists and biologists to justify belief that the geologic column represents billions of years of Earth history. This geologic column has become the showcase of evolution because the fossils are claimed to show ascent from simple to complex. Wow, a lot of stuff there. First, this reads like basically he wrote this in the 1980s and hasn't updated it. This is like the Kent Hovind thing where you write your script and then you just keep doing it even as like science just zooms past you, because nobody is dating like the age of the earth based on sedimentation rates in the 21st century, right? We have multiple methods of radiometric dating at any time frame you want, right? Whether it's 4 billion years for the age of the earth or more recent than that for different strata, may or may not contain fossils or organic matter, right? We have different ways of dating these things in an absolute sense. We're not using sedimentation rates. It's also wrong that we think that like sedimentation rates are constant over time. That's just simply not true, right? These rates change. You have net sedimentation, net erosion, kind of fluctuates over time. I'm sure my geologist friends would have a lot more to say about that, but it's not my field, so I will not say anything more about that. I will comment here that the geologic column has become the showcase of evolution because the fossils are claimed to show ascent from simple to complex. So I have a couple problems here. One, that's not really a claim, right? The fossils do get more complex as you move forward in time. Again, time measured through objective means, right? We're not doing relative dating. You can do objective dating here in an absolute sense. And things do get more complex over time, right? You don't find triploblasts down past a certain point. You don't find mammals down past a certain point. You don't find vertebrates down past a certain point in the geological column. So, like, yes, it's not claimed that that happens. That's a real observation. But then this other thing, ascent, is really interesting because it really it's a window into the mindset that we're getting here from Ken Ham, that like we humans, right, are the pinnacle, right? We're ascending from simple to complex, which in evolution, that's not really the case. I mean, we are more complex than, your average bacterial cell, but humans and bacteria that live in the soil outside are both at the end of a 4 billion year long history of life, and we've both spent 4 billion years adapting over that time to our respective environments at any given time, right? We've ended at very different places, but as a biologist, I don't like thinking about the term ascent, or like you sometimes hear higher and lower organisms. I don't like that language because it implies wishy-washy concepts. Complex versus simple, I think that's fine. You could absolutely say, humans, mammals, are more complex than bacteria, right? You could do that. But higher, lower, that language I don't particularly care for. I don't think it's informative in a biological context. So I wanted to point that out. So let's keep going. The age of the Earth is based on the assumed slow formations of Earth sediments. That's not true. Like, that's just not true. I don't know why you would say that. It's just like, I don't have anything to add to that. That's not true. All right, that's not how we calculate the age of the Earth. It's based on radiometric dating, multiple methods that will show you the same thing. Done. And then here, this is an interesting one, I think. Also, if the world was reduced to a shapeless, chaotic mess, as gap theorists propose, how would a reasonably ordered assemblage of fossils and sediments remain as evidence? Surely with such chaos, the fossil record would have been severely disrupted, if not entirely destroyed. This argument also applies to those who say the fossil record formed over hundreds of millions of years before this so-called Lucifer's flood, which, again, I'm skipping the theology, but there would have been another flood that happened before Noah's flood. It doesn't matter, whatever. But they're saying, like, just think about this for a second. Ken Ham is saying, how would we even have a geological column with these, fossils ordered from simpler to more complex, or ancestral to derived? How would we have this ordering of the fossil record if there had been a flood? Because that worldwide flood would have disrupted everything. Yeah, a worldwide flood would have disrupted that entire thing, wouldn't it? That big chaotic event would have disrupted the order of the fossil record. Is there another flood that enters the picture here? Right? What about Noah's flood? That's also a worldwide flood that disrupted and laid down tons of sediments. So why doesn't Ken Ham mention that problem in terms of the fossil record and a flood? He just kind of like I don't know. I just feel like that's staring you in the face as a contradiction here. I mean, obviously, I know why he doesn't mention it because it's a problem, but it's seems to be glaringly obvious that if we're going to say this other catastrophic flood event couldn't have happened because it's inconsistent with what we observe about the physical Earth, then the actual catastrophic flood event that you say happened couldn't have happened for the same reason. So I don't know what's going on there. Okay. True gap theorists also ignores evidence consistent with an Earth fewer than 10,000 years of age. Some of you are going to like this. There is much evidence for this. The decay and rapid reversal of Earth's magnetic field, the amount of salt in the oceans, the windup of spiral galaxies, and much more. This is like a greatest hits from like 1980s, like Dwayne Gish creation science, like old school creation science, which is kind of like where Ham came up, right? That's kind of where he made his bones. It's just funny that now here we are decades later and we're getting this stuff from the Answers in Genesis book, or one of the Answers in Genesis books. Like, this is just so old and hackneyed. Why are we even bothering with things like the salt in the oceans, spiral galaxies? Am I reading like Dwayne Gish and Henry Morris over here? What is going on? When I read this, I was just shocked that Ken Ham would like do this. Like, I was expecting better from Ken Ham. I didn't think he was going to go for like the vintage 1980s stuff. I thought he would have like kind of more up-to-date stuff, but apparently not. Actually, if you zoom in on this graphic, it's like very similar. It's all like those greatest hits of like, there's helium in the ground, there's coral reef growth rates, there's like, it's straight out of 1970s, 1980s creation science stuff. It's really amateur stuff here. That may bring us to the end of this chapter. There's some linguistic stuff here. I know some of you may be disappointed that we're not going to do the linguistics. Sorry. Yeah, I think that is it. Okay, so that's it for that chapter. So that brings us to chapter 6 here. Okay, and this is Cain's wife. Who was she? So this is also by Ken Ham, and this is basically like what's going on with Cain's wife. How did Cain have kids? Because Cain was the first son of Adam and Eve. So if Adam and Eve were the first people, then everybody else would have been siblings and or close relatives, right? So how did that work out? Well, Ham basically says, yeah, it was brother and sister, and that's fine because there was no sin, and therefore everybody was perfect, and it was fine. So here is the first thing here is just a little note for me that I think is funny, that skeptics of the Bible have used Cain's wife time and again to try and discredit the book of Genesis as a true historical record. I know that has been done. People have done that. I, follow anti-creationist work and creationist work semi-professionally. Like, I really stay up on this stuff and have for a long time, since like 2004-ish. I have not encountered this argument in the wild. I'm sure at some point people did. I know he references Inherit the Wind here, which, somewhat of an old reference. But like, this is not an argument that people break out, regularly. There's much better arguments to make than like, well, where did Cain's wife come from? I just thought that was funny. He does quote Inherit the Wind there. Let's see. So the next thing I have in here, and again, a lot of this is like theology stuff, and it just doesn't matter to me. But this paragraph is really interesting because it really, shows you AIG's whole philosophy here. So he says, since the Bible describes all human beings as sinners, we are all related. I'm going to skip the parenthetical. We're all descendants of first man Adam. If this were not so, then the gospel could not be explained or defended. And this is something that Ken Ham does all the time. So if you're ever reading or watching Ken Ham, this is something to just watch out for. It's making everything, all of Christianity, dependent upon a literal reading of Genesis, right? If Adam and Eve weren't literal people, if eating the fruit was not a literal event that happened, right? If original sin is not a literal event, if instead it is an allegory, right, then the rest of it falls apart. Now, there's two interesting things here about this. One is that theologically, lots of people do not hold this position, right? This is not like the consensus view. But the second thing that's really interesting is that this is something that Ken Ham does all the time and has been doing with increasing frequency and I'll say energy, which is basically calling other Christians fake Christians, right? If you are an old Earth creationist, even, or a theistic evolutionist, you're a fake Christian, right? If you don't buy the literal 6-day account of Genesis, approximately 6,000 years ago, according to Ken Ham, all of the rest of the philosophy falls apart. So you can't be a real Christian if you don't buy those things. And that's a problem for him because it alienates would-be allies, right? That's like you're getting a shrinking pool of people who are willing to stay on board for all the stuff that you're saying you need to be on board with in order to really be a member of the club. A lot of people are going to say, okay, I guess I'm not in the club then, to this kind of approach. And again, like this is a thing Ken Ham has been doing more and more over the last few years. It's really becoming like one of his big things, particularly as AIG has leaned more into like culture war stuff. You get a lot of this where if you don't check all the boxes, then you're not really real, in terms of your faith, which is, it's an interesting long-term strategy. We're going to see how it plays out. All right, let's keep going here. So we actually don't have that many more things here. One thing, I just love this line, just like as a, Adam lived for 930 years. We're just pre-supping that one. We're just saying, yeah, it says it. It's fine. We don't have to defend it at all. We're just going with it. Again, a little window into the mindset here of like, you see the silly graphics where it's like, start with the Bible. It basically comes down to just pre-sup kind of stuff. We're starting there. We're assuming it's fine. All right, let's continue on. There is one really big, interesting thing here that I'm excited to get to. So here we have a couple of things that go together. So I'm going to talk about them together here. We have overall, the human race is slowly degenerating as mistakes accumulate generation after generation. Now, two things here. One, this is kind of like a genetic entropy thing. This is like Dr. Sanford's genetic entropy idea that the human genome is degenerating and we're getting worse and worse over time as mutations accumulate. That's wrong for like a bajillion reasons. I've done videos on this. Other people have done videos on this. I'm not going to belabor the point here, but genetic entropy is population genetics fan fiction. None of it works. It just doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to leave it at that. There's no more to say with that, but there is a really interesting thing coming up here, okay? Because if you read this paragraph, right, you go into a little more detail of what he means by this. There's some interesting implications here that I want to point out. When the first two people were created, they were perfect. Everything God made was very good. This means their genes were perfect, no mistakes. But when sin entered the world because of Adam, God cursed the world so that the perfect creation then began to degenerate, that is, suffered death and decay. Over a long period of time, this degeneration would have resulted in all sorts of mistakes occurring in the genetic material of living things. So first, that's just a longer version of genetic entropy, right? He's still talking about genetic entropy here. But much, much more importantly than that, this flatly contradicts Ken Ham's bestie staff PhD, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, Harvard PhD, author of Replacing Darwin and Traced, both of which are dumpster fires. And I've reviewed both. You can check those out. And other people have reviewed them as well. They're dumpster fires. So Jeanson's whole shtick when it comes to genetic diversity in living things that exist right now is this model that he has. It's the CHNP model, created heterozygosity and natural processes. The idea here is that the original things created, whether it's humans or anything else, were created with lots of variation in the two copies of the genome that everybody has, right? We're diploid, right? Things that are diploid have two copies of each gene. They have two full sets of chromosomes, right? And in Jeanson's model, those two sets would have been very different, right? And then as different groups radiate and speciate from those original created kinds, what happens is that pre-existing diversity kind of assorts in lineage-specific ways, and the lineage-specific losses of different gene variants are how you get the species that exist today, right? So all the dog kinds, for example, wherever you draw the line for that, they share a common ancestor that was much more diverse than dogs or wolves or coyotes or foxes or whatever, wherever you want to draw that line, right? They've lost that heterozygosity over time. Now, Jeanson, in his book, Replacing Darwin, says that in his model, over 99% of the genetic diversity would be pre-existing, and just a tiny fraction of it would be due to mutations since creation, which is a direct contradiction with this idea of genetic entropy. Genetic entropy says all the variation is mutation. That's going to lead to a lot more heterozygosity, right? And Jeanson's model is a loss of heterozygosity over time. So Jeanson's model and genetic entropy are completely opposite in terms of the genetics of the entities we're talking about. Okay, they're complete opposites. Jeanson is start with all the diversity and then lose it over time, where genetic entropy and what Ken Ham is saying right here is you start perfect and then you accumulate lots of mutations over time as you degrade. Those are opposite. Those are opposite things from each other. I know Jeanson knows better in terms of reconciling these things. I bet Ken Ham doesn't. I think he just says whatever he says because he doesn't actually understand the science and probably doesn't care, right? As far as he's concerned, this sounds good. What Jeanson says sounds good. Jeanson's got a degree, fine, whatever. Like, just say it. That's all that matters. But you all who are, for some reason, interested in dealing with this stuff should know that those two ideas are directly contradictory, right? So when Ken Ham seems to endorse genetic entropy, he is contradicting. He is planting his flag and saying, I'm on Team Sanford and I oppose Team Jeanson. Right? That's what he's saying right here. And I find that really interesting. I think that is a really interesting thing, and we should be holding AIG and specifically Ham and Jeanson to account for that. We should, try to see what's going on there, because that's a fun contradiction. Okay, there's not too much left to cover here. There is some really weird stuff in here, I will say, about people accumulating mutations and makes your ears crooked and your nose crooked. And it's Ken Ham has this really weird view of what a perfect person would look like. It's perfectly symmetrical, a lot of, it just strikes me as uncomfortably close to some kind of really distasteful stuff that you would hear from incels. So it feels icky. I didn't even highlight it, but it's in there and it feels icky. But this thing right here is something I do want to point out. We must remember that our brains have suffered from 6,000 years of the curse. We have greatly degenerated compared to people many generations ago. We may be nowhere near as intelligent or inventive as Adam and Eve's children. I don't think we have evidence for that, which, obviously, but that's dumb. We can measure. I will say this, fully acknowledging that IQ tests and IQ as a measure is dumb. It doesn't work. It's not measuring intelligence in any reasonable way. Just put that out there. IQ tests are bad. That being said, IQ test scores have gone up. We're getting better at it, right? So if you believe, and I don't want to put words in Ken Ham's mouth, I don't know what he thinks of IQ tests, I have no idea, but a lot of people think they're valid. Okay, if that's your position, it is not mine, but if that is your position, then you have to acknowledge that we're getting smarter, right? You have to acknowledge that because this is a well-documented historical effect in the results of IQ tests. So, I don't know. I know where he gets the idea that we're, degenerating, right? But you need evidence of that claim, and we just don't have it. And you're certainly not going to get it by measuring intelligence. If you can find a way to do that, you're not going to get it. So that's the end of this chapter. We've reached the conclusion. I don't have any more notes in here. So that is it for chapters 5 and 6 of the, this is the New Answers Book 1 from Answers in Genesis. As you can see, chapter 7, which I'll cover in the next installment here, is carbon-14 dating. So we're starting to get into some radiometric dating stuff, which I'm really excited for. We can get back into the science and away from the theology. But even in those 2 chapters that were mostly about theology stuff, there was some sciencey stuff to talk about in there. And in particular, I think it's really interesting. 2 things jumped out at me. One is Ken Ham using just like ridiculously old and bad arguments for a young Earth, like the sedimentation rates and the salt in the ocean and the galaxy thing. Like, that's dumb. And we've known that's dumb since the 1980s, and it's kind of insulting to Ken Ham's audience that he's still doing that. And then the second thing is the endorsement of genetic entropy, which flatly contradicts Nathaniel Jeanson's work, which obviously we know Ken Ham is a big fan of Nathaniel Jeanson's work. So I find that interesting in here, and I was surprised by that. So that is it, everybody. Thank you for watching. I would appreciate if you would hit like before you go and maybe leave a comment, share, and if for some reason you found your way here and you haven't already subscribed, please hit subscribe. We do anti-creationist things regularly, and it's really fun. So thank you all for watching. I will have something for everybody next week. I'm not sure exactly which thing I'm going to go with, but I have a few fun things lined up, and so I promise it'll be worth your time. Thank you all. Have a great night. Goodbye.